Writing a great novel should be easy, since there are so many great novels already out there. Wouldn't you just be able to copy one of them? Copying other successful novels without understanding why they're successful, without understanding the reasons why they were successful, is a recipe for disaster. There is a lot that you can learn from these great novels, but you should be focused on learning rather than copying. Today, I'm sharing with you a framework for assessing why a novel is successful and whether or not you should copy it. This framework is actually something that my alter ego, Corporate Carl, came up with. I just don't really have the bandwidth to deal with this right now. There's just so many silos that we need to break down. You know what? Circle back with me, put something in my inbox, preferably a 90-minute meeting that involves 11 people who don't really need to be there. Turns out you can just walk into an office and start saying stuff like that, and you'll be a middle manager within 5 years. This framework is called the Horse, Zebra, Unicorn framework, and it's a way for assessing why something is successful. You can apply this to an entire novel, a character within a novel, or an individual scene within a novel. This works by classifying something as either a unicorn, zebra, or a horse, all of which owe their success to different reasons. I will get into some more detailed examples, but as a quick summary, unicorns owe their success to circumstances outside of the work itself. Zebras involve unusual or odd techniques that do well because of the specific context of the work, and horses follow generally established rules and expectations, and their success can be attributed to that. I'm going to get to some examples of each of these in a second, but I want to point out that none of these terms are meant to be derogatory in any way. Classifying something as a unicorn versus a zebra or a horse is not meant to diminish the success or the value of that work. It's just a way to explain some of the reasons behind that success. It does not make a value judgment about the quality of the work itself. All right, let's get into some examples of this, starting with the most magical and mystical of all, the unicorn. Unicorns, as I mentioned, owe a lot of, or at least part of their success to circumstances beyond the work itself. So the success can be attributed to factors that aren't actually part of the novel itself. The example I'm using here as a unicorn is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, specifically the prologue. This is very much specifically the prologue, not the whole book. If you haven't read it, The Way of Kings starts with an initial prologue, goes into a second prologue, and then I think there's a third kind of prologue where a character gets introduced and then that character is immediately killed, and then we jump 11 years into the future and are following an entirely different character. This novel, despite the fact that it was incredibly successful, breaks a lot of the conventional rules around starting a novel. Usually prologues are considered a bad idea. Having more than one prologue is an even worse idea. Usually we want to get introduced to the main character as quickly as possible, all of those sorts of things. Part of the reason that this novel was successful and was able to be successful in spite of breaking all of these rules is that Sanderson was already a somewhat successful author when he published The Way of Kings. He already had an audience, he already had a following, people already knew and had enjoyed his books in the past, so he was able to get away with some things that a debut writer might not be able to get away with. Any author who's written more than one book is benefiting from some level of unicorn effects. They already have an established reputation, which their work is resting on to a degree, rather than resting entirely on the merits of the work. When you read something from a debut author, the only way you have to assess them is the work itself. They don't have a pre-existing reputation. This pre-existing reputation leads to these sorts of unicorn effects. If a bestseller writes a bad novel that the critics pan and nobody seems to really like, it will still likely outsell a debut novel by some unknown author because the best-selling author already has somewhat of a reputation. A reputation that might be tarnished by the publishing of a bad book, but you get my point. Unicorns are dangerous because they depend heavily on the situation around how a novel is getting published. So the success can't be attributed to the work itself, which means that following that novel as a formula for success could be quite risky. Next up, the zebra. Zebras use unusual or exotic techniques or violate usual rules and conventions. But because of the context or the themes or other elements of the work itself, those unusual approaches end up working really well. This is different from a unicorn because a zebra is entirely based around the context of the work, not the author's popularity or other things going on outside of the work. It is entirely contained within the content of the novel. I also need to point out here that zebras are culturally contextual, and a technique is only considered a zebra if it's unusual or unorthodox for the audience that is reading it. An example of a zebra is the novel Push by Sapphire, which was the basis for the movie Precious. Push is written very heavily in the narrator's voice in a sort of direct stream of consciousness style, and the narrator, at least at the start of the story, is basically functionally illiterate. And the prose reflects that. It is very stream of conscious, lots of spelling and grammar issues, sentence structure, all of that. It breaks a lot of the standard prose rules that exist out there. This is obviously a very unusual technique because most people will advise you to adhere to rules like structure and grammar and spelling and all of those sorts of things. But this technique, this style works so well in this novel because it's a major element of the story. It's a major element of the character, and this style is a deliberate way to characterize the character. This is tied into one of the major arcs of the story, which is the main character getting more of an education, and the prose actually changes and improves as the story progresses. This is brilliant. This is a brilliant way to demonstrate character change and to characterize. I don't know of any novel that more strongly demonstrates character change than Push does with the narrator's voice. The reason that this technique works so well is it is very closely tied to the character, the themes, and the overall arc of the story. If you take this same technique, and I have seen other novels that try to do a heavy dialect or try to have misspellings and that sort of thing. If you take that technique and you apply it to another story where those elements aren't present, then it's likely not to work. Copying a zebra is dangerous because if your story doesn't have the same elements that make that technique work, then you're going to have problems. Zebra-like features also tend to take over an entire work. It becomes the thing that people will talk about your novel. So if it's not integral, if it's not core to what your novel is about, then it's just gonna seem like this weird thing that you've added on, and it's not going to work. Zebras have really unique features that people often like to take and copy into their novels, but they don't understand that there are other parts of these novels that are making them work, and if you don't also have those components, then you're just tacking on something that doesn't work for the sake of it. And the last category, the horses. Horses are practical, kind of expected novels that live within the bounds of what is considered generally good practice. At first, this might sound like a bit of a derogatory kind of term to say that something is boring and expected, but most of the successful fiction out there can probably be classified as a horse. The example I'm going to give here is not a novel, but rather an author, and that's John Grisham. Grisham is a prolific author who has sold millions of books. He's a multiple-time bestseller, but I wouldn't describe any of his writing as out there or experimental or strange or unorthodox. His work is well written, his plots are engaging, but there's also a bit of sameness to it. You know exactly what you're getting with a John Grisham novel. And this is totally fine. Thousands and thousands of people line up every year to read the new John Grisham novel. They're incredibly satisfied with it. They keep coming back for more. This is because they know what they want and they know that Grisham is going to deliver on that consistently. Horses are generally safe to copy from because they follow a lot of the established rules. If you want a reputation for being unique or innovative, then obviously that's not something to do unless being unique and innovative becomes part of your brand, then it's arguably a horse-like feature of your work. We tend to see the other two types discussed. People love to talk about unicorns, the massively successful books that break all the rules, or zebras, the new, innovative, original fiction. But the backbone of the literary market and what most writers build their career around successfully is these horse-type novels. These novels that don't necessarily bend the rules, novels that conform to expectations. It doesn't mean there isn't room for creativity, it doesn't mean that you can't push the boundaries, but it's more about creatively working within the bounds rather than massively changing them. Just like I hope this video massively changed your day because you sat here to watch it. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.